I want to make a couple of announcements first before we get started. One is this training is going to be recorded and archived for the benefit of those who can't join us today. Once the training is over, I'm going to archive this and put it up on YouTube, and then I'll send the link out to all the participants. That way you can either listen in again later if you want to, or share it with your colleagues that were unable to attend today. Have a couple of announcements because we have both WISs and VR staff on the line. For the WISs, as you know, as with all webinars that I do, you can count this webinar towards your 60 hours of continuing ed credit if your certification came from Cornell. If you have any questions about how to log in the trainings into your Cornell portal, you can email Ray Sabula's assistant, Michelle Elvord, at msa224@cornell.edu, and Michelle can log in those credits for you, guide you through that process. For the VR staff on the line, there are CRCs available for your participation today. If that's something you're interested in, send me an email after the training at Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, .klinger, K-L-I-N-G-E-R, at dars.virginia.gov, and I'll take care of making sure those credits are logged in for you. So today's webinar is on special Medicaid protections for groups of former SSI beneficiaries. And I chose not to focus on 1619B, only because I've done several trainings on 1619B in the past, and we're all pretty familiar with that one because it is so common. So I wanted this webinar to focus on the less common Medicaid protections that you might not be aware of. So I'm just going to start out by going through the handout that I sent around yesterday, and then I'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So I want to start out by talking about the first protection on my handout, which is the Pickle Amendment. The Pickle Amendment was named after the congressman that sponsored it, and it protects the Medicaid eligibility for people who have lost SSI due to cost of living increases in Social Security benefits. So that could either be disability retirement or survivor's insurance. There are several criteria for Pickle eligibility. So the client is either eligible for SSI in the month before the cost of living increases and their Social Security knocked it out, their SSI eligibility out, or else they have received Social Security and SSI concurrently. So they either have to be eligible for both SSI and Social Security in a month, or eligible for SSI in the month immediately prior to the month that caused their eligibility for SSI to stop due to the SSDI cost of living increases after April 1977. That was when the bill was passed. So clients who received SSI before that would not be covered under this. It has to be after that date. So when you're screening eligibility for the Pickle Amendment, the first question you would ask a client is whether or not they received both SSI and Social Security in any month after April 1977. If the answer is yes, they could potentially qualify for Pickle Medicaid. Second criteria is that the client meets all the other eligibility criteria for SSI, if not for those cost of living increases. So in other words, the client's still disabled, they have their unearned income under the 755 SSI threshold, their resources are below $2,000, unless they have something that protects resources like ABLE accounts or special needs trusts. The client is not currently eligible for SSI in the month where you screen eligibility for PICO, so they can't already be getting an SSI check to qualify for PICO Medicaid. And then the client has to be eligible for some sort of Social Security benefit in the month where you screen eligibility, so they have to either be getting disability, retirement, or survivor's insurance. How do you calculate PICO eligibility? So it's a very simple process. What you do is you take the amount of the client's current Social Security benefits and multiply it by the percentage on the chart that I gave you. And I'm just going to take a minute to open that website. If you could just bear with me for one moment until I get that web website up. Okay, so what I have up on the screen now is the PICL amendment chart. And so what you would do to screen eligibility for PICL is the following thing. First, you would ask the client in what month and what year did they last receive an SSI benefit. And then you would multiply their current SSDI benefit or other Social Security benefit they have by the percentage shown on the chart. Now, these percentages are based on whether or not there was a cost of living increase in that year. So if there is no cost of living increase in Social Security benefits, the PICL percentage does not go up. If there is a cost of living adjustment in benefits, then the percentage increases. And the example that I gave you on the handout that I'm going to go through in just a minute, I said that the client lost eligibility for SSI in September of 2010. So if this was your client, what you would do is look up the percentage for 2010 on this corresponding chart. So we see January 09 to December 2011, the percentage was 0.919. So going back to the example, I'll show you how you can apply this to screening eligibility for an actual client. Okay, so in this example of Jane, she last received SSI in September 2010 when she became eligible for SSDI benefits of $500 a month. That caused her to have too much unearned income to be eligible for a continued SSI payment when this income was added to the unearned income, the pension that she already had of $275 a month. You would determine eligibility for PICL Medicaid in the following way. So what you would do is you would take the $500 a month in SSDI that she reports receiving and multiply it by 0.919 that we saw on the chart. That's the PICL percentage from 2009 to 2011. That gives you a total rounded down PICL income of $459. So only $459 of that $500 that she receives in SSDI would count towards determining this. And then what would happen is that countable 459 is added to the 275 that she already gets in her pension for a total of $734 of total countable income. That's how much income that she receives counts towards Medicaid for determining eligibility for the PICL amendment. So because her countable income of $734 is below the current SSI threshold of $755, which includes the $20 unearned income disregard, she's still eligible for Medicaid. So essentially what PICL does is it protects Medicaid eligibility by disregarding all those cost of living increases in Social Security benefits that she received since her SSI stopped. So basically all those are excluded. And that's why she would still be eligible for PICL amendment, Medicaid. It's a very simple screening process, but it's just one protection that's not very well known or used very much. And that's why I wanted you to be aware of it, because you might have a client who is eligible for this provision and they just don't know about it. Next one I want to talk about is the protection for disabled adult children or DAC recipients, sometimes called childhood disability beneficiaries or CDBs. So the states are required to treat individuals as they were still SSI eligible, as long as the only reason why they lost their SSI payments was due to the receipt of the DAC benefits or an increase in those benefits. So if the only reason why a client loses eligibility is because they become eligible for the benefits or because of cost of living increase in DAC, then they could potentially have their Medicaid protected as long as they meet the following criteria. First one I talked about already, the client must have lost SSI due to the receipt or increase of the DAC benefits. The client is over 18 years of age because that's the minimum age that a client could qualify for DAC benefits. They have to be over age 18. And then they would otherwise be eligible for SSI if not for their benefits. So again, their unearned income is less than the SSI threshold, their resources are less than 2,000, unless they have a savings plan like a special needs trust or ABLE account that allows them to save more money, and the client is still disabled under Social Security rules. Similar protection exists for widowers and widows that receive survivor's benefits. States are required to treat those folks as they were still SSI recipients if the only reason why they lost their SSI benefits is due to the receipt of the widow or widower benefits. To qualify for this, the person would have had to receive SSI in the month before receipt of the widow or widower benefit. So they had to be eligible for at least 1 month in the past 12 months immediately preceding the receipt of the Title II benefits. And they're not eligible for Medicare Part A. What makes the widow Medicaid protection different than the CDB one is that the person that receives widow or widower Medicaid protection is only eligible for that protection until their Medicare kicks in. So typically what will happen is a client will be eligible for Medicare within 24 months of the receipt of the Social Security benefits. So once they're eligible for Medicare Part A, then the widower Medicaid would stop. And I see that I have a question in the chat box, but I'm going to just hold on to that for 1 more minute because I want to talk about how to help a client apply for these provisions. Now, I didn't include this in the handout, but I'll just go over it briefly. So in most of these cases, particularly in the case of a disabled widow or widower and a DAC, Social Security and social services are supposed to communicate with one another when a client appears to be eligible for either one of these provisions via the state data exchange. So what will happen, say for example, you have a client who's on SSI benefits, their parent is deceased, disabled, retired, all of a sudden they're eligible for a Title II DAC benefit. Social Security is supposed to flag that case in their system and code that person as a DAC, and then provide that information to the local Department of Social Services, where the local Department of Social Services is then responsible for making sure that the client gets switched over from an SSI recipient to a protected CDB recipient in their system to prevent a lapse of Medicaid coverage. Same thing for a widow or widower. If a widow or widower is on SSI, maybe they're getting benefits as a 65 or over and then their spouse dies, same thing's supposed to happen. Social Security is supposed to flag that case in their system, let Social Security know that they are now qualified for widower benefits, flag that case to the local social services office, and then social services is to make sure that that client is coded in the system correctly to ensure that there's no lapse of coverage. Now, I wanted to include these last two, and you don't see widow or widower very often, but I definitely wanted to include the DAC Medicaid and the PICO. Number one, because a lot of people haven't heard of the PICO amendment, and there could be a lot of clients out there eligible for it and not know it. But particularly the CDB one is important because we're seeing an increase in the number of clients that are under 22 that are either having a parent retire, become disabled, or deceased. And we're seeing an increase in the number of CDB cases that we're doing. I'm sure a lot of the WISs on the line have had some cases where the client's receiving CDB benefits in addition to others. So this is a great thing for you to know about. I had a case just recently where a WISA had a client who was on SSI, and the father was retiring, and Social Security said, well, now that your father's retired, you could be eligible for CDB benefits. And the CDB benefits were substantially higher than what the client was eligible for on SSI. He was eligible for half of the benefits on his father's work record, but he was reluctant to make that transition because the client didn't know about this protection that could protect the Medicaid. He had a waiver, and he did not want to lose that waiver. He couldn't medically afford to do that. So there was a lot of fear when it came to that transition. But after educating him on the protection, he did make that transition. So these are three important groups that that's good for you guys to know about, is the VR counselors and the WISs. And it looks like I have a question in the chat box. So Milton asks, does the DAC eligibility rule apply to all states? Some SSI offices report the way the regs are written. It only applies to 634 states. Okay, 1634 states are states where Medicaid is automatic for SSI recipients. For people on the line that might not be aware of that, some states, as long as you get $1 in SSI, you get automatic Medicaid. In Virginia is a 209B state, which means that people on SSI can get Medicaid, but they just have to file a separate application with the Department of Social Services. Milton, it used to be that the states only got informed via the state data exchange in 1634 states, but the POMS has changed. It happened several years ago where referral notices are given to the DSS in all states. So even though Virginia is a 209B state, those folks are eligible for this protection as well here in Virginia. That brings up an interesting point, though, is that just because the transition from, let's say, SSI Medicaid to DAC Medicaid, or SSI Medicaid to widower is supposed to happen automatically, it's not guaranteed to. There could be some miscommunication between SSA and DSS, and there could be a lapse in coverage. So sometimes it does take a little bit of advocacy on the half of the WISA, if the client has one, or a family member or payee, to follow up with Social Security and Social Services to make sure that transition is done. I always recommend, if the transition is not done, to put a request in writing for the client to be considered for these protections. It could say something simple like, I'm the payee for John Smith, his Social Security number is X, his SSI stopped on X date, and now he's receiving CDB benefits. I would like him considered for protection under DAC Medicaid. And then I would recommend sending that letter to Social Services and Social Security, certified if you're mailing it, or else bringing it down in person and asking for a receipt. That way you can verify that the request was received, and putting it in writing gives you a written record that you made the request. Might be necessary to attach a copy of the POMS that talks about these provisions with it, just so that the worker has clarification of the policy if they need. Okay, now I've only been talking for 20 minutes, but that was really all I had. eligibility criteria for these three groups is very simple. Screening process for PICL is simple, so there's not a whole lot of information that I need to provide. But I do want to give you guys a chance to ask any questions. You're in listen-only mode, so either type into the chat box or else just send me a message that you want your line unmuted and I can unmute it for you. Okay, looks like I have another question. Milton asks, what if the DAC benefits started more than 5 years ago and Medicaid was lost at the time? Will the individual be eligible to have the Medicaid start again? I would say yes. That would be a situation where you would need maybe to advocate with social services to make sure that happens. But as long as they were eligible for SSI at the time that the DAC benefit started, they should be able to get that Medicaid protection. But I'd like to emphasize again that the client has to meet all the other criteria for SSI in order to qualify for Medicaid under this. So if their resources go above $2,000 and they're not using any savings plan to exclude those resources, or if their unearned income is above the SSI threshold, or they medically improve, then this wouldn't apply. So I guess the answer to your question depends on whether or not the client would meet all the criteria for SSI still, if not for the absence of that DAC benefit. Does that help? Looks like I have a raised hand. And I have another question in the chat box. So Milton says it's been difficult getting social services offices to assess a case that has been closed for more than a year. Yeah, I would imagine so. And that's unfortunate because that case should have never been closed in the first place if the person could have taken advantage of this protection at the time. So I would definitely advocate with that. Maybe write a letter to the manager of that office along with a copy of the POMS, um, just stating what the policy is and seeing what can be done there. Because even though the SSI stopped longer than 12 months ago, it never should have kicked them out of Medicaid. So that would definitely be worth some advocacy, I think. If you have continued issues like that, and not just for Milton, but for anybody on the line where a person does qualify for these protections, and you're having trouble getting the Department of Social Services to respond to you, let me know and I can follow up with my contacts at DMAS. They do want to know about issues that people have with enrolling people in things like 1619B and Medicaid works and special provisions like this. So if you have continued issues with that, please let me know. And so Beth Martin asks, for the unearned income under the SSI threshold, is that unearned income other than the DAC benefits? So the DAC benefits would count as unearned income towards the SSI, so that DAC benefit would have to be less than $755 minus the $20 unearned income disregard. So if the DAC benefits are more than $755, then likely the client would not qualify for this protection because they would not meet all the criteria for SSDI. What would happen is, actually, no, that's not correct. I misspoke there. So what would happen is they have to keep other unearned income other than the DAC benefits less than 755. It's any unearned income in addition to the DAC benefits, not including it. I'm sorry about that. Okay, Milton says I have several cases I will forward to you. That's great. Please feel free to do that, and I will see what I can do. Okay, Abra has a question. So the person you mentioned that was on the waiver and qualified for the higher benefit, I'm curious if the person's income caused him to have a patient pay for his waiver services, or was the extra income excluded for the financial criteria of the waiver? Well, the patient pay really depends on what the client's income is. Some people have a patient pay, small one, others don't. There are certain allowances that DSS will take into account when determining how much income counts towards waiver. They will exclude things like a $40 personal needs allowance. They'll exclude money that the person has to pay out of pocket for healthcare premiums. If the person is institutionalized and has a spouse in the community, there's an additional allowance. And so the patient pay is really determined after deductions for all those things. And I actually have a waiver training scheduled next month on April 19th. We're going to have Susan Hart from DMAS on the line with us, and she's going to go through a detailed training on waiver. So, Abra, if you have specific questions about the waiver aspect, I would recommend that you come to that training if you can, and have your questions ready. And I'm sure that Susan would be able to answer those for you. If you can't make it, it'll be recorded and archived, just like the rest of them. And by the way, that training is going to be from 1 to 2 on April 19th. Oh, you're welcome, Abra and Nathaniel. Any other questions, concerns, or comments on these 3 Medicaid protections, or how to get a client approved for them? Milton has one. Is there any way we can get a copy of the DMAS regulations related to the DAC and PICL amendments to present to social services when making the request? Yeah, I can send you links to, it's both in the Medicaid manual, and Social Security has a POMS reference that goes along with that too. So I'll send you a link out to that, of that, and I'll send the links to everybody, just so that y'all have them. Actually, I probably should have included a link to the POMs on the handout. I just didn't do that. Okay, and I've only been speaking for about a half hour. I had this scheduled for 60 minutes, but that's really all that I had. I never know how many questions I'm going to get, so I always allow for a little bit more time than needed. But for the counselors on the line, you can still get 1 full hour of credit, and for the WISAs, I log in an hour or 2. And like I said, I will go ahead and archive this and put it up on YouTube and send out the links to everybody. Any last questions? Okay. Doesn't seem like it, but as always, I'm available by phone, 434-298-7652, or email Michael, Michael .klinger, Klinger, at gars.virginia.gov. Feel free to call me or email me anytime if you have any questions related to these provisions or any benefits or work incentives questions in general. I'm happy to assist in any way I can. Well, I thank you all for your time and participation and attendance today. And I will see you hopefully on the 19th of April for the webinar on Medicaid waiver. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.